I'm Charlotte Leslie, the Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, and welcome to the CMEC podcast. With the eyes of the world on the unfolding conflict in Gaza, attention has been averted from what is happening in the occupied West Bank, where 123 Palestinians have also been killed in violence since the horrific Hamas attacks against Israel on October the 7th. The West Bank has witnessed many incidents of settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank in recent months, and this has intensified since October the 7th, an issue recently raised by President Joe Biden. Here to talk about what is going on, I am joined from the West Bank by award-winning journalist Gareth Browne. Gareth, welcome. You're no stranger to reporting from conflict zones. So before we start, could you just tell us briefly a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I've been working in the Middle East as a journalist since 2016. I studied Arabic at university, and then I immediately went to northern Iraq. I spent the first year of my career covering the offensive against ISIS in Mosul. And since then, I've reported from Syria. I was based in Lebanon for a few years. And then about 2 years ago, I moved to Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, where I've been ever since.
So you've seen the situation escalating in the West Bank from Ramallah for a couple of years. What's been going on? What's the context to where we are now?
Yeah, I think there's been some interesting changes in the 2 years I've been here. I think there was an assumption that the West Bank was becoming more of a center of violence within the conflict. If we look at the Gaza Strip and Hamas's control there, they've run that enclave for over a decade. They've actually kind of stayed out of rounds of fighting with Israel in the past couple of years. They had a big war with Israel in 2011, but there've been 2 escalations from Gaza since then. But those escalations were done by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a militant group with much closer ties to Iran. And the assumption was that Hamas was staying out of these things and it wanted to keep the situation in Gaza quiet. So we were seeing these new militant groups emerge in the West Bank. So particularly cities like Nablus and then the Jenin refugee camp. So this increase in violence coincided with, I can almost describe it as a rotting of the Palestinian Authority, which is the administrative body which runs the West Bank. And it was, born out of the Oslo Accords in 1993. So as for various reasons that we can get into, the Palestinian Authority's authority has shrunk in the West Bank. Kind of smaller, more disparate armed groups had filled that gap, particularly in Jenin and Nablus. That also coincided with this new government of Benjamin Netanyahu's, which came to power at the end of last year. He brought in some members of the extreme right and the settler community. And that's really emboldened and enabled settler violence all across the West Bank. So it's been a kind of confluence of factors: the deterioration of the Palestinian Authority, a far more right-wing government in Israel, which has certainly turned a blind eye to settler violence, and then the focus by the likes of Hamas on kind of disrupting things and destabilizing the West Bank. So the kind of general consensus before October 7th was it was all eyes on the West Bank. This is where the next problem or future problems are going to arise from. And I think everyone sort of took their eyes off Gaza. Certainly the Israelis did. And this is an assumption we're having to question now.
Has there been an increase in presence of the army, the IDF, in the West Bank with settlers and more broadly?
Yeah, I think it's more the makeup of the IDF in the West Bank that has changed since the October the 7th. There were a lot more forces were sent into the West Bank as a result of this violence I described over the last year or year and a half. And, they were kind of largely there to try to keep a lid on this settler violence. I think since October 7th, we've obviously had Israel calling up hundreds of thousands of reservists, and they're sending lots of forces to the south, to the Gaza area, but also to the north, where there's kind of tensions building with Hezbollah and Palestinian militant groups in the south of Lebanon. But we've seen now a makeup of the IDF in the West Bank, which is kind of more made up of settlers. And it has an effect on how the soldiers behave, their rules of engagement. And now we're seeing really one of the most violent periods in the West Bank for a very long time. Last year was the most violent year in the West Bank for Palestinians for about 20 years. And at the current rate, this month could actually surpass all of last year. We're well into the hundreds in terms of Palestinians who've already been killed, by the IDF, but also by settlers. So I think since October the 7th, we've seen all of these issues exacerbated. It's almost like the violence has been cranked up a few notches, and the tolls in the West Bank are really devastating, almost regardless of what's happening in Gaza.
We've had some pretty awful stories about settlers uprooting Palestinian farms, bulldozing olive groves. In what way has settler behaviour changed over the past couple of years?
I think it's become more brazen. The fact is, you have advocates of some of these settler groups, some of which are very violent, in the government, holding key ministerial positions. You've got Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's Israel's Minister of National Security. You've got Smotrich, the finance minister. They're both from staunch representatives of the settler community. So there's a much lower willingness from the military, or whether it's unwillingness or inability from the IDF to push back against the violence. You're seeing certain communities in like key flashpoints in the West Bank emboldened. So a good example here is the south of Nablus. There's some particularly ideological and violent settlements in that area, and they're just more brazen. They're less restrained by the army. You could say the same in kind of the rural areas around Hebron in the south of the West Bank, where you have these rural Palestinian communities which are quite literally being wiped off the map. In recent days, we've seen villages essentially abandoned because settler groups have issued threats that if you don't get out of here within 24 hours, we're going to come back and kill you. And it's a difficult issue for the IDF. And I think until a few weeks ago, they were always keen to kind of portray that they were doing something about it. A few months ago, we saw senior officials within the IDF referring to certain settler actions as terrorism. And that was hugely enraged parts of the settler kind of community. The problem is now that pretense really appears to have been lost. The IDF aren't pretending to be doing anything about settler violence. In fact, there's evidence that soldiers may be encouraging it or even getting involved. So, I think if you ask Palestinians here in the West Bank, they would say, well, the army's sort of mask has slipped, and now they increasingly see the settlers who are committing these acts of violence and the army as one.
And to be clear, this is in breach of international rule of law and internationally agreed Palestinian territory, which is why we call it the Occupied Territories. Do you think the West could be doing more to uphold international rule of law, or is it difficult?
I mean, absolutely. When we use the term settlers, it's quite a particular legal term, and it refers to those living in illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank, which is, against the Fourth Geneva Convention. The West Bank is occupied territory. We see the British government and Western governments issue statements, and I think so far they've refused to meet with some of the more extreme members of this government. So Ben-Gvir and this Israeli government, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. But the fact is, despite what they say, zero action has been taken. And in fact, all the evidence points to this, settlement expansion increasing and the violence getting worse and the communities being emboldened and less restrained. So, I mean, many people here would say the British government could do more. But I also think there's a realization that this is not something that can be solved by the British government or by the US government. And we've seen quite an increasing number of statements by President Biden, and this has come up even in the last week or two, as this kind of crisis in Gaza has brewed. Biden has been on the phone to Netanyahu, telling him to do something about the settlers. And he's also mentioned it in phone calls with the PA president, Mahmoud Abbas, saying, we understand that this settler violence is a real issue. I mean, there are kind of bits around the edges that the British government might be able to influence. We have issues like settler products. We have a lot of factories in the settlements. And there's quite a strong debate going on in Europe at the minute about whether those products should be labeled as coming from illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank. Many people say they shouldn't be labeled as produce from Israel. So there's little things around the edges that can be done. But the fact is, I think Netanyahu's government have been so effective in just changing the facts on the ground. And now you have more than 500,000 settlers living in the West Bank. When Israel evacuated the settlements in Gaza, When it withdrew from Gaza in 2005, it was less than 10,000 settlers they evacuated, but they pulled out. And those scenes were really traumatic for Israel, the state of Israel, but for the army. You had officers within the army, refusing orders and being court-martialed. So now trying to imagine the army doing something like that on 10 times the scale is really quite difficult.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Leslie, the Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, and I am joined from the West Bank by award-winning journalist Gareth Browne. You've mentioned Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, and earlier you said that the Palestinian Authority was ebbing away and decaying, I think was the word you used. Can you talk a bit about that and how that's happened and what the effects are?
I think there's multiple tracks to the PA, the Palestinian Authority's sort of decay. I think some of the issues are to do with Israel's occupation. And I think it's been a policy of Israel's government in recent years, certainly, to undermine the PA and keep it as weak as possible, yet still keeping it alive.
Why would that be?
Well, the PA is at the minute, it's the logical path for Palestinians towards statehood. That's what it was always. It was never designed to be permanent. It was supposed to be the embryo of a Palestinian state. And under Oslo, it was meant to last 5 years, and kind of then onward steps would be taken, which would lead to the establishment of a full Palestinian state. Now, obviously, you have this right-wing government in Israel, which just has no interest in allowing the Palestinians to have their own state. But then the PA does serve a purpose. You'll often hear Palestinians using the phrase or describing the PA as a subcontractor of the occupation, and it has ministries and it runs municipal services. And it means you don't have to have Israeli generals, running hospitals in the West Bank or taking care of the population here because it's occupied territory. Israel is legally obliged to do. So it does some of the dirty work for Israel. So, I think in the eyes of most of the Israeli security establishment, the full-blown collapse of the PA is not in their interest. They don't want to have to patrol the streets in Ramallah. They don't want to have to fix sewage pipes in Nablus, these sorts of things. But they also don't want a rejuvenated Palestinian Authority, which could be a viable partner for peace and which might force them to make concessions, which could nudge the Palestinians closer to statehood. So it's a kind of, it's sort of stuck on life support, if you like.
I guess the alternative is Hamas, and that doesn't seem to have been, well, it is certainly, after the murderous terror attacks on Israel, that is obviously appalling, but it doesn't seem to have helped the Gazans very much either. So surely an Israeli government would prefer a Palestinian Authority, one would think, to an emboldened Hamas.
Yeah, and I think this is the conundrum that Israel finds itself in at the minute. It's spent years undermining the PA, and now it's, kind of stated it wants to go into Gaza and crush Hamas. And everyone's asking, well, what happens to Gaza after that? There's more than 2 million Palestinians living there, and they're not just going to go away. I think this idea of them being forced into the Sinai Desert in Egypt is very unlikely. Egypt's very against that idea. Israel has come out and publicly stated that it wants to, get rid of Hamas in Gaza and remove its military capabilities and remove it from governance in Gaza. And then the question is, well, what would replace that? And I don't see much appetite from the Israelis to reoccupy Gaza with this heavy invasive occupation that they had, before 2005. But then they turn to the PA, which they've been, deliberately undermining for, a decade now, and said, oh, actually, we might need you guys to go in and run Gaza. And Palestinian officials here in Ramallah are very reluctant to do that. They can't be seen to, as they say, ride into Gaza on the back of Israeli tanks and set up shop and run the place. So, this is a conundrum, I think, which is part of Israel's own making, that we don't have a viable PA at the minute that could take over. I think it should also be said that, the PA has also been an enemy of itself. President Abbas has repeatedly delayed elections. He's centralized rule. He's done everything he can from within to undermine its democratic accountability and its institutions. And in the last few years, just ignoring the occupation for a moment, Abbas has really turned the PA into a one-man show. He's put his ultra loyalists into positions of power, and basically nothing happens in the Palestinian Authority without him saying, yes or no. So there's a wholesale need for reform just purely on a Palestinian level. The PA needs to have elections. It needs to rejuvenate its legitimacy. And the only way it can do that is through elections. And only then can it start to think about, taking back control of the parts of the West Bank which have fallen out of its control, aka Nablus and Jenin, but also potentially returning to Gaza. So, you both have the Israeli occupation's undermining of the PA, but you also have this sclerotic system which has developed under Abbas and got a lot worse in recent years.
It's going to be a really difficult context for any rejuvenation of a party to happen. And that's no easy thing, as we know from the UK, in much calmer politics. How will that happen? Is there a role that other states can play? We've already said that, there's only a limited amount the UK can do, and even the US. What about regional actors, Egypt, Saudi? Where do they stand on this, and what could they do?
I think here is one of the only causes for optimism. And I'm talking specifically about Saudi Arabia. Over the last 6 months, we obviously saw a lot of talk regarding normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That follows on from the countries that signed the Abraham Accords a couple of years ago, the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco. And on the surface of it, that seemed like if Saudi were to normalize with Israel, it would open the door for many other Muslim countries, maybe Pakistan, Indonesia, to do so. And that was seen as being a disaster for the Palestinians. Actually, I think perhaps counterintuitively that alongside those talks, we also saw this rewarming of Saudi-Palestinian relations. I think MBS was really re-engaging with the Palestinian issue. And I think he understood from about 6 months ago, maybe even longer, that you can't ignore this issue. You can't forget about it. And he wasn't going to sign a normalization agreement with Israel that threw the Palestinians under the bus. And when the attack on Israel by Hamas happened on October 7th, I remember thinking, well, surely the Saudis now are going to say, oh, we're out. Why did we bother? But actually, they're staying the course. They're speaking regularly to the Palestinians. They're speaking to the Americans. They're speaking to the Iranians. Before October 7th, there was a spring in the Palestinian step. The knowledge that Saudi Arabia was kind of willing to get involved in the Palestinian issue was giving people here in Ramallah something to be optimistic about. And they haven't cut and run since the 7th. They're still speaking to the Palestinians ready. They're still speaking to the Palestinians. So I think Saudi is going to play a key role if the PA can be rejuvenated, both in a political sense, but also in terms of money. Obviously, there's going to be a massive need for reconstruction funds in Gaza. And there's even talk of Arab states playing some sort of administrative role, perhaps even just temporarily in Gaza. But the PA here in Ramallah is facing a real financial crisis. And it was already facing a financial crisis, but it's got a lot worse since October the 7th. It has for many months struggled to pay the salaries of civil servants and also security forces. Now there's about 34,000 members of security forces in the West Bank. Now it seems that this month, the PA is only going to be able to pay perhaps 50% of their salaries. And this is from financial pressures that predate October 7th. So next month, we're going to see the effect of the war on the West Bank's economy. So crucial to bear in mind here, about almost 200,000 Palestinians from the West Bank work in Israel or in Israeli settlements. And they bring a lot of money into the West Bank. It's a really important source of revenue for the PA and for the West Bank's economy. That's almost completely ground to a halt. You also have Israel withholding customs revenues, which it's supposed to transfer under its international obligations. So you have an acute financial crisis, which is brewing here. Now the worry is, what if this month the PA are paying their security forces 50% of their salaries? What if that drops next month to 30 or 40%? At what point do a significant number of those 34,000 security personnel stop showing up for work, take their guns back to their villages and decide, you know what, I'm not going to stand for the PA. I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to do my role for the PA, and perhaps there'd be a right source of recruitment for the other armed groups in the West Bank, whether that's Hamas or Islamic Jihad or just some of the kind of smaller, more localized groups. I think in the short term, this is an area where the UK government and other countries can play a role. If they want to stop the PA from collapsing, they need to make sure that these salaries are being paid in the coming months. And essentially that's money, a couple of $100 million, and they can assure that the PA can, pay these salaries through to the end of the year, but also, meet its financial commitments to the banks here. That is the most obvious way the British government can help. The problem is, since October 7th, all of the indications show that Britain, Europe, and the US are kind of leaning towards doing the opposite. A number of countries have announced funding to the Palestinians under review. And really, it's the financial crisis that could be the death of the PA, rather than these security issues that are kind of taking the headlines at the moment.
Is that somewhere Saudi could help?
Saudi could definitely help as well. This is definitely a place where I can see Saudi Arabia stepping in. I think we can look back on that speech by Faisal bin Farhan, I think it was earlier this year or last year, where he said, this kind of time of writing blank checks is over. I think we're in crisis mode at the minute. The PA is in crisis mode at the minute. But I think in the long run, for these kind of international donors to step in and save the PA, they're going to want to see this reform. They're going to want to see the re-legitimization of the presidency and of the PA. And they're going to want to see the parliament here, which is right next door to where I'm staying at the minute, sitting again. So they in the immediate term, they need an injection of funds. But in the medium term, they need that, sustained donor support. But they also need to be told, that this support is not going to come unless you rejuvenate yourself and reestablish legitimacy with these desperately needed reforms.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to journalist Gareth Browne from the West Bank. Gareth, where does Iran sit in all this?
Iran is playing an interesting role. There's been kind of conflicting reports about the extent of Iran's involvement in the Hamas attack on October 7th. It depends what you believe. I'm inclined to believe that Iran wasn't directly involved in the plans for that attack. Everything I've heard and read suggests to me that October 7th was planned by a very, very small group of Hamas commanders in Gaza, and the political members of the group in Doha and in Turkey and in Lebanon didn't really have a full understanding of what was happening until it happened.
But they seem to be enormously well-resourced. This doesn't seem like resources that a militia group would easily have hold of.
The Iranian links with the Al-Qassam brigades, that's Hamas's armed wing, are very, very well established. And there's no doubt that Iran is a source of funds, weapons, and rockets. I think that is a Hamas inventory that's been built up over a decade or more. And I think Hamas in Gaza has also become a very, very resourceful organization. They have the ability and the capacity to build, some of these rockets. Their immediate reliance on Iran for things like rockets has lessened in recent years. But, I think if you look at the fundamentals of that operation, it was a very well rehearsed and disciplined attack by, perhaps over 1,000 Hamas fighters. And, everyone I've spoken to said, if Iran were directly involved in the planning of it, it's far more likely that the Israelis would have got wind of it. But then Iran also has this role it's been playing in the West Bank for the last 2 years, pouring money in and weapons in and trying to rock the boat here. And that's particularly evident in Jenin camp up in the north, where they've kind of funded these groups who have been attacking Israeli targets in the West Bank and Israelis and Israel, places like Tel Aviv. So they've been trying to destabilize the West Bank, certainly, as much as they've been, kind of throwing money and arms at their allies in Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza.
And then you've got Jordan next door, where they've got their neighbours, Syria and Lebanon. There's a massive captagon narcotics smuggling industry going on. And I guess those networks through Jordan into the rest of the Gulf and the world of captagon could be used for other things. And that's a Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Iran push, isn't it?
I mean, on that, there's no doubt that some weapons are coming through that way. But I will say, having been to probably more than 100, funerals in Nablus and Jenin in the last 2 years, the vast majority of the weapons there are Israeli made. One of the biggest sources of weapons in the West Bank is Israeli military stockpiles, corruption and theft of those weapons by armed criminal groups in Israel, and then they're brought in and sort of sold to the militant groups in the West Bank. That's a really critical source of weapons in the West Bank. I'm not saying that the Iranian kind of networks that come in through Syria and Jordan or Lebanon aren't an issue, but for the West Bank, most of the weapons are coming through these means from the Israeli military stockpiles. The Captagon is an issue. I think Jordan is in a very, very delicate situation at the moment. The Jordanians see the Palestinian Authority as the only real sort of protection against Israel's, well, annexation of the West Bank. They're fully behind the PA and Mahmoud Abbas. Having spoken to Jordanian officials, they're really, really worried about what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the West Bank. And there's the potential, more than 60% of Jordanians are of Palestinian origin. And we have seen in the last few weeks massive demonstrations, not just in Amman, but all over Jordan and outside the Israeli embassy in Jordan. And the potential for domestic unrest, I think, is quite significant. We saw the King of Jordan in Cairo just a couple of days ago, and he spoke in English, which was very interesting at an Arab summit for him to speak in English. It was, quite an impassioned speech, and he's calling on the world, calling on Britain to do something. So if we're looking at regional conflagration, we tend to, I think in the last few weeks, we've been speaking a lot about Lebanon and the possibility that Hezbollah might get involved. We've obviously got IRGC groups in Syria. We've seen the Houthis firing missiles at Israel from Yemen. But I think we also need to look at this second track, which is the scenes coming out of Gaza and the settler violence in the West Bank promote and prompt instability of the PA in the West Bank. And that could cause serious domestic problems for Jordan. And they're very, very concerned about that. So it's definitely something to kind of keep an eye on. I think when we look at Jordan, we know it's in a troubled neighborhood, but we don't associate it with these Iranian proxies like you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? So it's a different kind of challenge that it's facing, but it's very concerning times for the monarchy.
CMEC was in Jordan at the end of September, 22nd to the 26th of September. And I guess our key takeaways were that, and these are my words, Jordan is kind of stuck in a toxic triangle. You've got the Captagon industry and the destabilizing effect there. It was described more than once to me as a war in dealing with that smuggling industry. You've got an unsustainable number of refugees in Jordan. They're massively hospitable, obviously, as the Hashemite tradition, but an unsustainable number, which they said, well, look, we didn't have anything to do with the causes of these people being refugees. That wasn't us, but we're dealing with it. And then thirdly, an acute water shortage, all set against a struggling economy because they don't have the same mineral reserves as the rest of the neighbours in the rest of the region. So that even before October the 7th, they seem to be in a very tricky position. And with this happening, you do ask, to what extent, how destabilizing that will be.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember just how critical the Palestinian issue is for the monarchy in Jordan. The king has a very important role in East Jerusalem. The King of Jordan is the custodian of the holy sites in East Jerusalem. It's a very, very delicate role which Jordan plays, and it's custodian because the Jordanians believe that once a Palestinian state is established with East Jerusalem as its capital, this would then be handed over to the Palestinians. So it's not a permanent role. The country has such a big Palestinian population, it actually almost has to treat the Palestinian issue as a domestic one. This is not entirely foreign affairs for Jordan. So when something happens in the West Bank, it's like it's happening in Jordan. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so delicate. So there are these fundamental issues, fundamental questions of the role that Jordan plays in, dealing with Israel and the Israel-Palestinian conflict. They're being tested in the last few weeks and months. And then, as you say, on top of this, the country has got serious water problems. It hosts all these refugees. It's got that northern border with Syria. And as you say, it's fighting this war, trying to keep Captagon out, trying to not be a transit for Captagon. So it seems like it's fighting battles on all fronts. And this is one of the UK and the US's closest allies in the region. And I know from speaking to Jordanian officials, they've been warning about the West Bank for the last 2 years. They've been publicly saying how much of a risk this settler violence and harassment and aggression at the holy sites in East Jerusalem is. And I think there's a feeling that they haven't been listened to. And it's not that they're saying, I told you so, but it definitely seems that they've sort of been proven right, because everyone is talking about what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank now, not just in isolation of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, but in terms of how it is going to play out across the region. This is something that the Jordanians have been saying for a long, long time.
You're speaking from Ramallah and I'm speaking from London. So I'm going to ask you I'm going to give you a really simplistic scenario and ask you a question about how the West is seen. So you could say that following the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it became apparent that the Middle East, the Global South, and the Far East take a very different view from the West and NATO on many things, and that particularly came out through the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Many were saying the Middle East is in lots of ways undeclared. It sits geographically between the great economic powerhouse of China and then also looks to the US, and that the West should compete to be a global ally of choice. Has the West completely burnt its relations with the Arab world through its response to the events of October the 7th and Israel's response?
This is a great question. And I think if you zoom out, there is no doubt that every part of the world other than North America and Western Europe is coalescing against them, whether it's the Global South, Arab states, Islamic states in Asia. It's almost a hark back to sort of a clash of civilizations sort of thing. I don't think there's any understanding in the UK about just how alienating their policy on this conflict is towards friends and allies in the developing world, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in any part of the Global South or the Middle East. And these things are not forgotten. So yeah, I think this conflict is causing devastating divisions among the global order. And how long can that go on? How long does it take, whether it's North America or the UK to realize that, how long does it take, whether it's the UK or the US to figure out the gulf, to understand the gulf that is developing between them and, African states or states in the Middle East? It's incredibly vast. And it's like two different worlds when people are talking about the conflict in the UK compared to what you hear them talking about, whether it's on the streets here or you hear through media from the Arab world.
And Russia and China?
Russia and China, absolutely. I mean, Russia plays an interesting role, right? Russia's always sort of been more friendly to the Palestinians, and they've had this interesting relationship with Israel, especially over Ukraine. Russia controls the airspace over Syria, and the Israelis have been striking Iranian targets in Syria for many years, and they never wanted that to close. So you always saw that Israel's support for Ukraine in light of the Russian invasion was also always somewhat restrained, and that frustrated the US and the UK and even the Ukrainians. And, since the 7th, we've seen the Russians have been quite vocally supportive of the Palestinians, and even a Hamas delegation went to Moscow just a few days ago. You can kind of see Russia fulfilling its role as a troublemaker here. But the general point is there is this massive, massive gulf developing, and I don't see that Western governments are even aware of its existence yet.
Well, Gareth, probably on that note, thank you very much. You're speaking from Ramallah. I'm here in London. And thank you very much for giving us a voice from Ramallah and helping us understand a little bit the extent of that gulf and what we might need to do to fix it. And I very much hope we can speak again.
Pleasure. Thank you.